Conflict, like it or not, is part of human life. Conflict with our families, conflict with our neighbors, conflict with coworkers, conflict with random strangers on the internet. Not that we face conflict with all these people all the time, but every morning we wake up and the potential is there. That might sound like a pretty bleak perspective on life, but conflict isn't always a bad thing. When approached from a mature and healthy place, it can be an opportunity to come to new understandings and new ways of doing things that in the end are perhaps better for everyone. It's just that that's not always the way it happens. Sometimes instead we find ourselves lying in wait for the next mistake, disparaging people we care about, attacking character, digging in our heels, or responding with passive aggressiveness. Not things we're proud of, maybe, but again, part of the human condition. It should come as no surprise to us that Jesus, having taken on the entirety of the human condition, finds life to be full of conflict as well. The first sign of conflict came at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry in his own hometown of Nazareth, when his neighbors ran him out of town. And for a while, that seemed like an isolated incident. Everywhere else he traveled around the region of Galilee, people loved him. By last week, though, he had started attracting the attention of religious experts, scribes and Pharisees, who came from as far away as Jerusalem to see exactly what was up with this new guy. "Who are you to forgive sins?" they asked when Jesus offered forgiveness to the paralyzed man who had been lowered through the roof by his friends. "Who do you think you are? God or something?" Well, things only go downhill from there. Since last week's healing story, Jesus has added another disciple to his crew. This time it's Levi, a tax collector, a Roman collaborator despised by any good patriotic Jew. After Jesus calls Levi to join him, Levi has a party for Jesus at his house with all of his tax collector friends. The scribes and the Pharisees are there in the background complaining. "Why do you eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And then, "Why don't your disciples fast? John's disciples fast." "No one pours new wine in old wineskins," Jesus responds. "Out with the old, in with the new." They are perhaps not wrong to hear this as a veiled threat to their authority. In today's reading, Jesus and his disciples are out and about when his disciples get hungry. They pick some grain from a nearby field and they rub it in their hands, separating the edible part from the husk. There's nothing inherently wrong with this. Biblical law allows a person to pick small amounts of grain from a neighbor's field. But it's a Sabbath, and work is forbidden, including the work of harvesting and threshing. Does it count? Somehow the scribes and the Pharisees are there, just waiting in the wings to say that it does. Pharisees, am I right? We in modern Christianity are trained to hate Pharisees. Pharisee is a dirty word. Pharisees are people who act all high and mighty about tithing and then turn up their nose at a homeless visitor. They're the people who care more about what hymns we sing than who we're actually reaching with our message. Pharisees are legalists, hypocrites, people who are more obsessed with rules and rituals than, love. This all is perhaps not entirely fair to the historical Pharisees, a sect of Jews who cared deeply about God's law and what it meant to follow it in day-to-day life. In the words of the Jewish New Testament scholar, Amy Jill Levine, the Pharisees would have been respected teachers, those who walked the walk as well as talked the talk, with interpretations of Torah designed to make ancient readings relevant to the society of their day. Pharisees, for the record, are also the ancient forerunners of modern rabbinic Judaism. Clearly, though, the Pharisees and their friends, the scribes, are depicted in a pretty negative light in the Gospels, where they appear as the archetypal opponents of Jesus and his message of love and grace, at least until he attracts the attention of the temple bureaucracy in Jerusalem. And this incident in today's reading is no exception. Here, our Pharisees spring out from the sidelines, having caught Jesus and his disciples red-handed. "Why are you working on the Sabbath?" they cry. Jesus is ready with his answer. There is precedent for this sort of thing, even in the holy scriptures that they revere so much. David once allowed his soldiers to eat bread that was meant as an offering to God because they were hungry. And as it turns out, God cares about hungry people getting to eat. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, he says in the end. Just like Jesus has the authority to forgive sins, he has the authority to interpret Sabbath rules as well. For the meantime, his opponents have nothing to say. The scene then shifts. It is another Sabbath, and Jesus is back in a synagogue teaching. The scribes and the Pharisees are there again. Also in the synagogue that day is a man with a withered hand. Jesus sees this man in need in front of him. And he also sees his opponents watching. I imagine Jesus doing the mental calculation here. Should he maybe tell this man to come back at sundown when the Sabbath is over? Is it really worth creating conflict unnecessarily? What's a few more hours, really? But on the other hand, what would that say to everyone if he prioritized the rules over this man's need? Or, maybe that's just me. Maybe Jesus was actually pretty clear on what needed to happen. I'm just not sure that it's always as cut and dry as we think. This passage makes me think of a time at my previous appointment, my previous church, when I was at the church for an evening meeting. I was in charge of the pastor's discretionary fund there, just like I am here, the fund which existed in order to help community members with emergency needs. And the demand for this fund was so overwhelming that we'd had to put some pretty strict boundaries around it, or it just took over life. It took over everything. So I took appointments on Wednesday mornings, and that was it. On that night, though, a committee member who arrived for the meeting said that there was someone downstairs who wanted to see me. It was a man who needed a hotel room for his family. They had no place to stay that night. I told him I only did this on Wednesdays. He protested, understandably, that he didn't need the help Wednesday. He needed the help right away. I said I was sorry. Those were the rules. It may seem heartless to you, but if you were me in that position, I think you would have understood. Still, I've never forgotten that conversation. Never stopped wondering whether I did the right thing to keep my established boundaries rather than respond to an immediate need. Now, I don't say any of this to justify myself or even as a confession. I say it because, again, these things aren't always as clear-cut as they may seem. Boundaries, including Sabbath boundaries, are there for a reason. They're important. The Pharisees know that. Jesus knows that. And this person's need is real. What's the purpose of the Sabbath anyway? Asks Jesus in essence as he heals the man's hand. Is it not to make us more attentive to how God is at work in this world rather than less? Is it not to increase love of God and neighbor rather than to help us create excuses? Jesus has told us from the beginning of his ministry, from the beginning of Luke's gospel, that God's purposes for us are life and freedom. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. Jesus is not opposed to the law. It's just that the law was also supposed to point God's people toward that freedom and abundance. It was supposed to be a blueprint for how to live an abundant life as God's holy people. Instead, in some cases, the rules became the end rather than the means. And that's not a Jewish thing or a Pharisaic thing. It's a human thing. We all fall into that trap sometimes. But God intended love. And sometimes Jesus teaches us, love breaks the rules. Hasn't he shown us that from the beginning? Love breaks the rules when Jesus tells the people who raised him that the good news isn't just for them, but for outsiders too. Love breaks the rules when Jesus admires the faith of the men who dug a hole in a stranger's roof so that their friend could be healed. Love breaks the rules when Jesus goes to a dinner party with those carpetbagger tax collectors. Love breaks the rules when Jesus encounters someone in need of healing on the Sabbath. Love breaks the rules when God becomes human. Love breaks the rules when death gives way to life. It's not that the rules are bad. It's just that sometimes we make them more ultimate than they are. I remember watching a video once about parents whose kids had come out as gay. One mother in this video had ultimately accepted her son for who he was, even though she had struggled in the beginning because of what her faith taught. I love my religion, she said, but I love my son more than my religion. I heard that and I thought, isn't that exactly what Jesus taught? That sure, it's good to love our religion. It's good to love our country, maybe even our political identity. These can all be good things that help us live well. But when loving any of these things comes into conflict with loving our neighbor, doesn't Jesus teach that we should love our neighbor? Has love ever broken the rules for you? Have you ever been welcomed in a place where you might not have expected to be welcomed? Have you ever been forgiven for something you didn't deserve to be forgiven for? Have you ever allowed love to challenge your own thinking about what was important and necessary? As our Pharisee friends know, rules are important. Our disciplines and the tenets of our faith keep us on the right path. They guide us in knowing God's will. Personally, I suspect that it was in part all of those Sabbaths that Jesus had kept throughout his life that gave him the wisdom and the authority to say, no, this isn't the point right now. Because if there's one ultimate rule, it's love. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And we may not always agree just what that looks like or how we live that out, but it is there, calling us forward. And the good news is, love is there to meet us too.